They built 60 vacation units on my federally protected wildlife refuge. I was away for 1 month, and they decided that was their window of opportunity. Or so they thought. By the time I discovered the sprawling development, spanking new cabins, half-finished recreational structures, and a future clubhouse sign hammered crookedly into a centuries-old tree trunk, I understood exactly how bold these people were. Bold, yes, but also ignorant. In my everyday life, I keep a low profile. I prefer counting elk populations, monitoring wetlands, and preserving habitats to stamping official seals on some fancy letterhead. I suppose that's why they assumed I was just another quiet caretaker, someone with zero political or legal muscle to stop their project. Big mistake, because the moment I set foot on those brand new steps leading to their so-called Mountain Vista bungalows, they'd effectively declared war on the one guy in Redwood County they never should have crossed. I was raised on this land. My father made me promise I'd protect it when he passed, and I took that oath seriously. The wildlife refuge is more than just a random patch of forest in Northern California. It's home to dozens of endangered species, a sanctuary that even the State Wildlife Commission recognizes as indispensable. My official title is National Park Liaison, a job that might sound like I just hand out brochures or arrange educational tours, but in reality, my role grants me broad authority to enforce federal and state conservation laws. And that means I can shut down entire projects in the blink of an eye. I can wield fines so large they'd make corporate CEOs sweat. Yet most folks in Redwood County know me simply as Carter Lane, the quiet ranger who visits the local diner every weekend. The day I returned from a month-long assignment near Yellowstone, I arrived on the refuge at sunrise. I wanted to check the state of the wetlands after an unseasonably hot spell. Instead, I found bulldozers tearing through the undergrowth, erecting at least a half-dozen prefab cabins. And that was just the beginning. When I walked deeper into the property, I counted row after row, some completed, some half-built, each with placards reading Unit 1, Unit 2, all the way to 60. The vast scale of it took my breath away, not in awe but in anger. My father's refuge looked like a construction expo. Trucks rumbled across newly flattened dirt roads, leaving the stench of diesel in a once pristine grove of old-growth redwoods. I recognized a few local contractors, but they avoided eye contact as if they knew they were complicit in something ugly. I marched up to the nearest worker I could find, a weary man with sawdust on his shirt and despair in his eyes. "Who authorized this?" I demanded. He lowered his gaze, fiddling with a notepad. "We have the HOA's approval, sir," he mumbled. "Says it's part of the Redwood Heights community expansion." My mind churned. Redwood Heights? That development lay on the outskirts of the refuge, separated by a natural stream, or at least it was supposed to be separated. Redwood Heights had an active homeowners association run by a charismatic but notoriously relentless woman named Marjorie Black. Locals joked she had the entire county zoning board in her purse. But it was no joke now. Her name was plastered all over the construction orders. I recognized the signature from previous run-ins, back when Redwood Heights tried to dump waste into my wetlands, and I shut them down for a few weeks. She'd pulled strings to come back online eventually, but we'd never had direct confrontation, until now. I left the worker and stormed deeper into the site, where I spotted a glossy sign hammered into a tree stump. Future Redwood Heights Eco Resort, private HOA residents and guests only. The audacity made my blood boil. They were calling it eco, building right in the middle of a protected habitat. It was as if they believed that labeling something green covered every environmental sin. I took out my phone, snapped a few pictures, then dialed the local sheriff's office. No one picked up, which surprised me until I remembered the sheriff's daughter was on Redwood Heights' payroll as their public relations manager. Small-town politics can be a twisted web. Frustrated, I drove across the property line to Redwood Heights proper, a neighborhood of identical houses perched on carefully manicured lawns. The HOA's main office was housed in a large community center with a sign out front boasting about tennis courts and a heated pool. Inside, I was greeted by an anxious receptionist who blinked repeatedly when I told her I needed to speak to the HOA president. She apologized, said Ms. Black was in a very important meeting, but I insisted. After a tense minute of me glowering and her tapping frantic messages on her tablet, she led me down a corridor to a plush office. Marjorie Black was seated behind a massive oak desk, wearing a tailored suit that screamed confidence. She wasn't alone. Two men in suits flanked her, a younger attorney type and an older man who had the look of a worn-down local council member. She glanced up from a thick binder, her expression a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance. "Mr. Lane, I presume?" she asked, standing with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I nodded curtly. "That's right, Ms. Black. I just came from my refuge. Why are your bulldozers there?" She exchanged a glance with her companions, then stepped forward, extending her hand. "We prefer to call it Redwood Heights Eco Resort," she said with a practiced warmth. "We're expanding our vacation rental facilities, hoping to bring more tourism to Redwood County." I didn't shake her hand. "You built 60 cabins on a federally protected wildlife refuge." Her smile tightened, but she pretended to look sympathetic. "Your father's land is indeed beautiful, but we have the documentation to prove it's zoned for development. Redwood Heights purchased that tract from a private seller." My stomach lurched. There was no possible way my father would have sold that property. He'd placed it under a perpetual conservation easement years ago, meaning it couldn't be sold or developed. I'd personally filed the paperwork at the county seat. Something stunk of corruption. "Show me that documentation," I said, my voice trembling with anger. The older man fiddled with a briefcase, producing copies of land transfer forms, each bearing suspicious signatures and notary stamps. Ms. Black tapped the forms. "As you can see, Redwood Heights owns the northern portion of your father's land. We followed all the proper channels. This was approved by the county zoning board last year, but no one contested it." I took one look at the date on the forms and recognized it as the day after I'd left for a multi-state inspection tour. Convenient timing. "My father never sold a single acre," I hissed. "He died 8 years ago, and even if he had, the conservation easement overrides any so-called sale." She shrugged elegantly, exchanging a sly grin with her attorney. "I'm sure we can clarify all that with the county." It was time I pulled rank. I'm not just some random caretaker. I'm the official National Park Liaison for Redwood County, tasked with protecting these federally recognized lands, and I have the authority. Ms. Black cut in, her voice laced with condescension. "Authority? This is a local matter. Our attorneys have cleared everything through the county. If you intend to cause a stir, Mr. Lane, we can easily bring in our own legal counsel." It took every bit of willpower not to slam my fist on her desk. Instead, I leaned forward. "Ms. Black, if you don't cease construction immediately, you'll be facing far more than local codes. We're talking federal penalties, potential felony charges for disturbing protected habitats." Her expression flickered with doubt, but then hardened. She signaled for her attorney to escort me out. "I suggest we handle this civilly," she said, voice icy. "File your motions if you must, but Redwood Heights will not halt construction. We've invested too much." I left, seething, and drove straight to the Redwood County Recorder's office. I needed to confirm that the easement was still on record. After all, I personally had it notarized and filed. But when I arrived, an overwhelmed clerk sifted through documents, eventually emerging with a perplexed look. "There's a note here that the easement was revoked last summer by the property owner." She showed me a single-page document bearing my father's signature, again, obviously forged. My father had been gone for nearly a decade. The clerk shook her head, apologizing. "Everything looks official to me, sir. If you believe it's a forgery, you'll have to prove it in court." That was the moment I realized how deep this conspiracy ran. Ms. Black and her HOA associates must have bribed or manipulated local officials to slip the revocation through. The question was, how high did it go? Redwood County was small enough that a few well-timed donations and personal favors could shift entire rulings. I recalled my father's final words to me. "Guard the refuge with your life, Carter. Predators aren't always four-legged." He never would have guessed how literal that might become. With my phone nearly dead, I raced home to call in reinforcements. My home is a modest cabin near the edge of the refuge, old enough to have questionable wiring but surrounded by pines so tall they blocked the midday sun. Inside, I fired up my laptop, hammered out emails to federal colleagues, and rummaged through my old files until I found the original conservation easement documents. Then I emailed my friend Andrea, an environmental attorney in Sacramento, who had fought countless battles against unscrupulous developers. If anyone could help me bring the hammer down on Redwood Heights, it was her. She replied within the hour, telling me she'd gather her research team. The next morning I returned to the refuge, accompanied by a local wildlife officer named Jay Morales. Jay was a stand-up guy, the kind who carried me through rough terrain last winter when I broke my ankle while tracking elk. He was also no fan of the Redwood Heights HOA, having witnessed their shady attempts to reroute a creek without a permit. As we surveyed the half-constructed cabins, Jay whistled low. "They sure moved fast, Carter. I haven't been out here in weeks, and this... well, this is a whole village now." I gave him a grim nod. They think speed is on their side. The bigger the project, the harder it is for the county to yank it all down. We approached a group of workers installing a drainage system in the wetlands. Jay flashed his badge and a foreman scurried over, clearly nervous. I demanded to see their environmental impact report. The foreman admitted they didn't have one, just a verbal go-ahead from the HOA. That was all I needed to confirm a major violation of both state and federal laws. I documented everything, snapping photos of the disrupted wetlands, the muddy water, the torn-up reeds. Rare migratory birds use that exact spot to nest. The devastation was heartbreaking. Yet Redwood Heights kept pushing forward, convinced they were untouchable. Late that afternoon, I tried calling Ms. Black to warn her one last time. I got her voicemail, so I spelled it out clearly. "Ms. Black, this is Carter Lane. If you do not halt construction immediately, I will file a federal injunction and request criminal investigations for willful destruction of protected habitat. This is your final warning." Of course, she didn't bother calling me back. So I escalated. First, I reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service requesting an emergency inspection. They're typically slow to respond, but mention an HOA bulldozing a refuge and you get bumped up the chain. Then, with Andrea's help, I compiled a case for an immediate temporary restraining order, which we filed at the Redwood County Courthouse. Our motion included photographic evidence of the cabins, the damage to wetlands, the forged signatures, and the suspicious zoning board approvals. Usually, these cases take months. We pressed for an emergency hearing, citing irreparable harm to federally protected species. The judge scheduled a hearing for the following week. Word spread fast. Some Redwood Heights residents who were in the dark about the alleged eco-resort started asking questions on social media. A few supportive messages popped up, urging me to protect the refuge. But there were also defenders of the HOA, calling me a roadblock to progress and accusing me of hoarding land that could stimulate local tourism. The local news even interviewed Ms. Black. She played the victim, claiming Redwood Heights had acted in good faith and had no idea about the federal protections. I nearly threw my phone at the wall when I saw her smug face on the screen. The tension peaked 3 days before the court hearing, when a Redwood Heights security guard tried to lock me out of my own property. He stood at the new metal gate they'd erected, saying I needed a pass to enter. A pass to the land my father and I had protected for decades? The sheer nerve. I flashed my government ID, explaining that I had every right to be there. He insisted that Ms. Black had authorized him to keep intruders away. That's when Jay drove up in his official state-issued truck, lights flashing, telling the guard to step aside or face arrest. The guard backed down, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes when Jay mentioned the phrase federal offense. Sure enough, Ms. Black arrived minutes later in a sleek SUV, furious that we'd bypassed her roadblock. She glowered at me, demanding to know why I was harassing her staff. I couldn't help but laugh, though it sounded more like a snarl. "Harassing? You're the one who trespassed on a protected wildlife refuge to build your personal paradise," she shot back. "We purchased it legally, Carter, and you can't keep ignoring that fact." I clenched my fists. We'll see what the judge thinks about your forged documents." She blanched but quickly recovered, flipping her hair dismissively. "I have the best lawyers in Redwood County. If you want to fight, you'll get one." Her arrogance made me pity her in a twisted way. She had no clue the scale of the legal avalanche heading her way. Redwood County might be her playground, but the moment federal conservation laws come into play, local strings can only be pulled so far. I told her as much, adding a quiet promise. "You might not fear me, Ms. Black, but you should fear what I represent." That evening, I holed up with Andrea and Jay in my cabin, finalizing our case. We discovered more unsettling details. Redwood Heights had started marketing these vacation units online weeks ago, promising exclusive access to Redwood County's newly discovered scenic hideaway. They'd sold pre-construction packages at top dollar to out-of-state buyers who believed they were investing in legitimate ecotourism. The hoax was elaborate. Meanwhile, the wetlands and wildlife continued to suffer. Every bulldozer track was another open wound on the land. The day of the hearing, Redwood County Courthouse swelled with reporters, curious residents, and Redwood Heights supporters who believed the HOA's side of the story. Ms. Black arrived in a tailored gray suit, flanked by her attorneys, 3 of them, each carrying thick binders. Andrea and I had a modest stack of evidence, plus moral support from folks who'd grown up cherishing the refuge. The presiding judge was a no-nonsense woman named Meredith Shaw. She wasted no time, calling our case first. I presented the highlights: the original conservation easement with my father's signature, the timeline of Redwood Heights' suspicious land grab, the blatant destruction of wildlife habitat, and the fabricated revocation form. Andrea backed me with the legal precedents, citing specific state and federal regulations Redwood Heights had violated. Then Miss Black's attorneys took turns portraying me as a busybody ranger who'd blocked Redwood County's economic progress. They flaunted the so-called sale documents, claiming Redwood Heights had done everything by the book. One attorney even smirked while describing how excited the community is for this new development. I suspected the hearing would be tense, but it turned downright explosive when the judge examined the alleged signature from my late father on the revocation form. She asked Ms. Black if she'd personally verified it. Ms. Black stammered, I was told it was legitimate. Our notary verified it." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Your father died 8 years ago, Mr. Lane." She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Yes, Your Honor. That's what makes this signature impossible." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Ms. Black's attorneys tried objecting, but the judge waved them off, ordering them to produce the notary for questioning. They squirmed, promising to bring him in later. She frowned. "This is a preliminary hearing for a restraining order, so I'll keep it brief. Based on the evidence, it appears Redwood Heights might have engaged in unlawful development on federally protected land." She gave Ms. Black a warning glance. "I'm granting Mr. Lane's request for a temporary restraining order. All construction on that site must halt immediately pending a full investigation. Are we clear?" A hush descended on the crowd, broken only by the rustle of reporters scribbling notes. Ms. Black's face was a mask of fury. She tried to interrupt, but the judge hammered her gavel. "I said, are we clear?" Ms. Black exhaled shakily. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Then, we'll reconvene in 2 weeks for the full hearing. Mr. Lane, if Redwood Heights violates this order, notify this court at once." We walked out of that courtroom with a wave of relief washing over us. But I knew the fight wasn't over. Miss Black's scowl lingered in my mind, and I could guess what her next move would be: stall, bully, or bury me in counterclaims. But at least for now, we had a legal freeze on construction. The refuge might have a chance to heal if the bulldozers stayed idle. Sure enough, Redwood Heights ignored the restraining order the very next day. They merely scaled back, finishing certain cabins already under contract. That's when I contacted the federal agencies. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Environmental Protection Agency all had potential jurisdiction. The next morning, Ms. Black got the shock of her life when multiple federal vehicles rolled onto the site, official seals shining in the daylight. These agents carried the clout to impose staggering fines or even jail time for willful violations. I watched from a distance as Miss Black argued with them, gesturing wildly at half-built structures. The agents, calm and methodical, wrote citations and took pictures. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Media coverage exploded. Local stations interviewed me about the significance of the refuge and how Redwood Heights had bulldozed protected wetlands. Ms. Black tried damage control, issuing press releases blaming clerical errors and misinformation. But the more she talked, the more tangled her story became. Meanwhile, Redwood Heights investors started pulling out, demanding refunds. Lawsuits threatened to pile up from the buyers who discovered they'd purchased cabins on illegally developed land. Just when I thought the tide had turned, Redwood Heights unleashed a new tactic. They organized a huge community rally near the refuge entrance, framing it as a protest against government overreach. They bussed in supporters from neighboring counties, waving signs that read, "Let Redwood Grow" and "Stop Lane's Land Grab." The entire scene was bizarre. These people championing a project that destroyed wildlife habitat, all while calling me the tyrant. I recognized Miss Black at the center of it, giving an impassioned speech about jobs and tourism, throwing in lines like, "The Redwood economy depends on forward-thinking development." I refused to engage them directly, but the sight gnawed at me. Jay stayed close, reminding me that everything we did had to remain above reproach. "Let them wave their signs," he said. "Public sentiment changes fast once the truth comes out." He was right, of course. The press had already started reporting on the forged signatures and the conservation easement fiasco. Redwood Heights was quickly losing credibility outside its loyal bubble of supporters. The 2 weeks raced by, leading up to the full hearing. My nerves felt like steel wires twisted too tight. We suspected Redwood Heights might try to bribe officials or manufacture more bogus documents, but we stayed vigilant. Andrea uncovered an explosive piece of evidence, an email chain from Redwood Heights' lead attorney to Ms. Black, discussing the need to expedite the easement revocation by any means necessary. A whiff of hush money hovered over those emails referencing certain county clerks. This was the smoking gun we needed to bury Ms. Black in a legal avalanche. Court convened again, a bigger crowd in attendance this time. Reporters filled the back rows. The Redwood Heights faithful clustered together, scowling at me. Ms. Black's attorneys wore grim expressions, and I noticed the older man from her office, the council member, was conspicuously absent. Possibly he'd jumped ship. The judge took the bench, eyes flicking from Ms. Black to me, then signaled for opening statement. Andrea presented our case calmly but powerfully, pointing to the chain of forged documents, the illegal revocation of the easement, the willful disregard for the temporary restraining order. She introduced the new email evidence, which the judge read with a growing frown. Then Ms. Black's lead attorney tried deflection. "We were misled by a third party," he insisted. "My client, Ms. Black, had no knowledge of any forgery." Andrea gave a derisive laugh, earning a warning glare from the judge. Then she methodically picked apart their timeline, exposing Ms. Black's direct involvement in the forged paperwork. Faced with the unstoppable logic of the facts, Ms. Black's defense crumbled. The judge's voice was cold by the time she delivered her verdict. "It is clear Redwood Heights obtained this land through fraudulent means. The conservation easement was illegally revoked with a forged signature, and the development on that property is in violation of state and federal environmental regulations." She ordered all construction to cease permanently, with Redwood Heights mandated to restore the refuge at their own expense, replanting wetlands, removing or dismantling every single cabin. She also referred the case for possible criminal charges related to the forgery and the destruction of protected habitats. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Ms. Black looked like she might faint. Her attorneys stood there, stiff as statues, likely contemplating their next step. The Redwood Heights supporters in the gallery whispered among themselves, some outraged, others confused, but the law was the law. Redwood County might have officials Ms. Black could sway, but she couldn't outrun federal authority. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters thronged, asking how I felt about the victory. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was still seething at the damage inflicted on the refuge. It's a win for conservation, I told them, but the land will need years to recover. We can't just replant a 100-year-old stand of redwoods overnight. Ms. Black slipped out a side exit, avoiding the press. In the weeks that followed, Redwood Heights tried one last Hail Mary, negotiating with the federal agencies to keep some of the cabins. That proposal was immediately shot down. They were forced to hire specialized crews to dismantle the brand-new structures, salvage what materials they could. A small crowd gathered each day to watch the cabins come down, piece by piece. People took photos of the humiliating spectacle. Ms. Black, I heard, stepped down from her HOA presidency in disgrace. Her board members scurried like rats from a sinking ship. Once their leadership crumbled, Redwood Heights itself faced internal elections to replace the entire HOA board. Some residents demanded an external audit of the HOA's finances, suspecting Ms. Black had misused funds to grease palms. Meanwhile, with Ms. Black out of the picture, the local council launched an investigation into bribery at the county clerk's office. A few officials resigned abruptly rather than face public scrutiny. The rumor mill churned out stories of hush money in envelopes, secret nighttime deliveries, and political promises exchanged for signed permits. Redwood County might never be the same. Maybe that was a good thing. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. I worked tirelessly alongside the agencies to ensure Redwood Heights adhered to every letter of the court's restoration order. They removed the cabins, cleaned up the bulldozed wetlands, and planted new saplings in areas that had been stripped bare. It wasn't perfect. Nature can't be replaced with a wave of a checkbook, but it was a start. At least no more forklift trucks tore up the soil, and the wildlife slowly began returning to the edges of the refuge. In time, with careful stewardship, the land might heal. When everything settled, I took a moment to reflect. I stood at sunrise in the heart of the refuge, near a shallow pond that used to be teeming with waterfowl. Some had returned, warily circling the muddy water. I saw a flash of wings as a heron flew overhead. That small sign reminded me why I fought so hard. People like Ms. Black see land as something to exploit, an asset to be flipped for profit. But for me, land is a legacy, my father's and everyone else's, who cherishes open spaces. A reporter from the local news approached me one day, wanting a final comment about the fiasco. "Did you ever imagine it would escalate to this level?" she asked. I shook my head. I knew Redwood Heights was pushy, but forging documents, building 60 cabins in secret, that shocked even me. They wanted quick profits. They found out the hard way that greed doesn't trump the law. She jotted notes, then asked what I planned to do next. I paused, glancing at the refuge's boundary where the bulldozers once roamed. "Continue protecting this place," I said, "for however long it takes." A few months later, Ms. Black was indicted on multiple charges related to fraud and environmental violations. Rumors swirled that her attorney had cut a deal, providing evidence of who else was involved. Redwood County's political scene braced for a shakeup. Redwood Heights residents elected a new HOA board, one that reached out to me directly, offering to collaborate on any future developments near the refuge. I graciously accepted their olive branch. I'm not against progress, but only if it respects the land and the creatures who call it home. In the end, Redwood County learned a valuable lesson. There's no such thing as above the law when it comes to protected wilderness, and my father's refuge remains just that, a refuge, rather than a tacky timeshare. The final blow to Ms. Black's old empire came when the new HOA board publicly apologized to the entire county, vowing to never again meddle with conservation lands. That apology, printed in the local newspaper, was a testament that the tide had truly turned. Sometimes, folks still ask if I ever lost sleep, wondering if maybe we could have come to a compromise. My answer is always the same. When it comes to forging documents and destroying habitats, compromise isn't an option. You either protect the land or you surrender it. And I, for one, will never surrender.